It's great to welcome to the program today David Shor, who's a data scientist who consults with Democratic groups and has a number of insights into many different areas of the political world, is the way I say it. Glad to have you here today.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's just start with 2020 polling. I mean, how off or on was it? Certainly, Joe Biden was winning the popular vote polling, and he won the popular vote, and he became the president. There were certainly some states in which the numbers leading up to the election did not quite work out. I mean, what's your sort of overall assessment of what's happening with polling right now?
Yeah, well, first, I guess disclaimer, I think in some ways it's funny that going into election night, we thought that Joe Biden would win and that Democrats would get 50 or 51 Senate seats, and the end result, Joe Biden is president. Democrats do have 50 Senate seats. So I think that is kind of funny. But that said, the polling was actually fairly bad this year. Just to put numbers on it, I think there's kind of two distinct problems, with polling. One is just that the numbers were way too high for Democrats. On average, there was about a 3% bias toward Democrats, and that's in vote share, which means that in terms of margin, you're looking at roughly 6%. This happened on basically every level of government, on the Senate, on the House, on the presidency. And if you were looking at polls, you were coming in expecting that Biden was going to win states like Florida, that we would have maybe like a bunch of Democratic seats, and that we were supposed to pick up 10 seats in the House. And, none of those things happened. And then I think on top of that, it's not just that the polling on average, was too Democratic, but the kind of error pattern by state, really matched what we saw in 2016 and, what we saw in 2018, where these states in the Midwest with a lot of, non-college educated whites really we saw a strong overestimation of support. I think there was a Quinnipiac poll or in Wisconsin right before the election where it said that Biden would win by 15, and he ended up winning by less than 1. So yeah, I think it was a pretty bad cycle for polling. And then just the last angle, just to recount all the ways the polls were bad this year, is just in terms of looking at coalitions. The big changes in this election, roughly speaking, were that non-college whites were, basically where they were in 2016. College-educated whites swung something like 6 or 7% toward us. African Americans swung 2 points down, and I think Hispanic voters, now that all the data's in, looks like they dropped by like 9%. And the polls didn't really see any of those trends coming. There was like a little bit of warning signs, with non-white voters, though it ended up being worse than the polls thought. But if you looked at the polls really told this story that we were going to see education depolarization, that non-college whites were going to trend toward Democrats and college-educated whites were going to, stay basically where they were last time. And that just didn't happen. If you just look at the college non-college gap, it looks like the polls were off by something like 10 or 11%, which is actually crazy. In a lot of ways, the polls were a lot worse than 2016.
So let's dig into one aspect of this, which is that the concept of polling is you can't poll everybody. So the idea is you get a representative sample. And what does it mean that it's representative? Often we're talking about, well, we'll normalize it for education, or we can normalize it for race. We can normalize it for political affiliation. You can normalize it for age, all of these different things. But one of the things you really can't normalize for, correct me if I'm wrong, is the types of people that are more likely to participate in a poll versus the types of people that are more likely to opt out. And we heard this from some on the right who kind of said it as a lot of Trumpists don't trust the polls, so they either give deliberately fake answers or don't participate. And there's no great way to deal with that as a pollster. How much truth is there to the general idea of people willing to and not willing to participate, and then maybe more specifically to some of the explanations that were given by supporters of former President Trump?
Yeah, I think in some ways, I think there's something to the story. I do want to be clear that if you ask someone who they're going to vote for in a survey, they do generally tell you the truth.
Okay.
It's not an issue with trolling. But, that said, I think one of the big drivers for why the polling was so wrong this year and why it was actually worse than 2016 was that there were really giant, differences in who was answering the phone. Something that, the way that, the firm I worked for, the way that they do polling, they actually match people back to voter files. And so we can see their party registration. And something that was really clear is that starting around March, Democrats became much more likely, to answer the phone than Republicans. And I think and they kind of stayed at these elevated levels throughout the entire election. And I think there's a pretty clear story that this had a lot to do with lockdown, that Democrats were literally home. There's like a lot of cell phone mobility data that really shows that Democrats stayed home and they didn't really have much to do, and they started answering surveys at high rates, and Republicans weren't doing that, and they just weren't picking up the phones. But generalizing, that was an issue with this year, and I think it was clear. But even in 2016, when we look back at why the polls were wrong, and I think this bias continued now, like, why is it that pollsters have such a hard time measuring opinion in states that have a lot of working class white people? And originally, people really talked about this in terms of Trump turning out a lot of new voters. And I think that there's a lot of evidence now that that's not really true, that, all of these election switches were really driven by people changing their minds as opposed to changes in who voted. But then the question is, why were the polls wrong? And why were the polls wrong in working class areas? And it kind of comes back to this concept of social trust that political scientists and sociologists like to talk about. And so that's just operationalized with this question of, do you think that people can be trusted, or do you think that people should keep to themselves? And something that's pretty wild, just socially, is that the government's been asking this on a very high quality survey. They spend a couple $1,000s per person and they get like a 70% response rate. Phone response rates are closer to 1%, just for reference point. And they've been asking it since the 670s. And it used to be that, roughly 55% of people said that people could be trusted. And that figure is down to 30%. So that's sociologically very concerning, though above my pay grade. But it has measurement implications because people who say that people can be trusted, kind of unsurprisingly, are a lot more likely to answer phone surveys. And that used to not matter very much, because how much you trusted the people around you and how much you trust institutions just used to not be that correlated with partisanship. But in 2016, Donald Trump really reshaped the coalition. If 2012 was basically a fight over whether or not we should have universal health care, 2016 was much more of a referendum on like, how much do you trust the people around you? And we were only talking in these surveys to these high trust people who say that people can be trusted. And there was literally this hidden majority of low trust folks who went in the other direction. And so, we've actually looked and crosstabbed. And if you look among people who said that people could be trusted, that group swung toward Democrats by, something like 4 or 5%. But the other group went completely in the opposite direction. And, this high trust sample, that was the people we were polling, and that's the world we expected to see on election day. But then they didn't actually answer. And, the same thing, people don't realize happened in 2018. Democrats won, so they didn't notice. But if you look at the actual margins in places like West Virginia, places like Michigan, places like Ohio, the elections were much closer than the polls originally thought, even if we ended up winning. And then we see the same thing again, in 2020. And I think that social trust is a very important, angle for understanding it.
One of the things I saw you, to shift gears a little bit, I read some of your tweets about, which I find very interesting, is about the bias of the Electoral College. And you posted a couple things that I find really interesting. One is that you posted the partisan bias of the Electoral College over time. And one of the things you found is that Democrats now need about 52% of the vote in order to have a 50-50 shot of winning the presidency, given that it's not the national popular vote that decides, but rather the electoral vote. And then the other really interesting thing is that there's this notion that part of what makes the Electoral College depart in terms of its orientation from the popular vote is that small states are really overweighted relative to their populations. And you pointed out something very interesting, which is that in terms of the difference makers, when it comes down to who ultimately wins the Electoral College, it's more about the fact that there are some larger population states which are relatively close, could be 52-48, could be 55-45, 60-40, but because they are winner take all, you are essentially, I don't know if the right word is disenfranchising, but if you're part of the 42% of Democrats in a big red state, your vote essentially doesn't matter for calculating the Electoral College. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just important to, say that the bias in the Electoral College, I think, is very new. It is true that, Gore won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College, but the bias of the Electoral College was really quite small that year. Gore got something like 50.2%, and he very, very narrowly lost. And so that was like random and not really that big a deal. And really, the Electoral College at various points has favored Democrats. It's if Barack Obama in 2012 had gotten about 49.5% of the vote, he actually still, probably would have won. That's why people talk about the blue wall. There are basically these big. This is just a little bit of a history lesson, but there are just these big Midwestern states that kind of had their economies centered around farming and manufacturing, and as a result, they're both relatively white and also have relatively low education levels relative to the rest of the country. And the Electoral College really comes down to who does well in these places. And in 2012, Obama, a lot of his appeal was he actually did very well, with Midwestern whites. He did better in the Midwest than Kerry and really than a lot of Democrats before him. But he also did well enough among college-educated whites to make places like Virginia and Colorado competitive. So the Electoral College had like a small bias in his favor. 2016 totally changed that, though. And, it's really great if you can see the graph because, it just kind of wiggles around zero. And then there's just this sudden plunge to there being, I think, a three-point gap bias in the Republican favor. And I think that that's the really underappreciated part of understanding 2016, which is that Barack Obama got about 52% of the two-party vote in 2012, and Hillary Clinton got 51.1% of the vote. And in any other democracy, that would have been fine. A 0.9% decline, still, comfortably above 50. But the problem was that the Electoral College shifted from being about half a point bias in favor of Democrats to being 3 points bias in favor of Republicans. And then that bias increased again. And so it's helpful to put numbers on these things. And, just to get to your other question, I think people really don't understand why the Electoral College causes this bias. As you said, it's not that you have these tiny states. It's not about Wyoming. In order to get to 270 states, you have to win states like Wisconsin, like Minnesota, like Ohio. And there just happen to be a bunch of relatively evenly divided states that right now are somewhat more Republican than the country overall. And I think the key point is that the reason why this happened is because Democrats have started doing so much worse among working class white people. And, unless that gets reversed, I think it's unlikely that this is gonna revert. I think a lot of people expected that, things would get better this year. And the key point is that the bias went from 3 points in 2016 to 4 points in 2020. And so it really just shows how unworkable, our coalition is under this set of rules.
Absolutely fundamental insights to understand, really, in thinking about future elections. I mean, if one does not understand reality as it is, it's hard to run a campaign that is based on that reality. We've been speaking with David Shor, who's a data scientist who consults with Democratic groups. You certainly should follow him on Twitter, as I do. David, I so appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.